This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Otelia with tonight's top stories. Typhoon Krathon's landfall in Taiwan is now expected on Thursday, with shops closed and markets halted today. 40,000 troops are on standby for the emergency response. Well, escalating Middle East violence has East Asia on alert. Japan's Prime Minister calls Iran's missile attacks on Israel unacceptable, while South Korea and China evacuate some of their citizens from Lebanon. And South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol vetoes 3 bills, including a contentious probe into First Lady Kim Kyun-hee's alleged corruption. The opposition plans to push for a revote. And Hong Kong equities resume their advance after a one-day break, with Chinese property counters leading the charge. Even defaulted developers seeing their stock prices more than doubling. Ahead on East Asia Tonight, we look at the darker side of success, a mixed blessing for Chinese athletes after achieving honor and glory for their country as fan culture turns toxic. And this beloved icon of transport in Japan turned 60. The high-speed, high-tech marvel that reshaped cities is showing no signs of slowing down, with plans to go even quicker. Offices and schools across Taiwan are shut today as the island hunkers down in preparation for Typhoon Krathon's arrival. The storm may have weakened slightly, but it is still classified as a severe typhoon and is expected to bring about storm surges and torrential rain. Ahead of making landfall, at least 1 person have died and dozens more injured. 2 others are missing. Tens of thousands of troops are on standby for emergencies. Well, Krathon is an unusual storm for Taiwan this season. Taiwan regularly gets hit by typhoons, but they generally land along the mountainous east coast facing the Pacific. But Krathon will make landfall on the island's flat western plain in the early hours of Thursday. And it is expected to hit between Kaohsiung and Tainan before moving towards Taipei. More than 10,000 people have been evacuated from vulnerable areas as a precaution. And for more, we are joined now by CNN's Victoria Jen in Taipei. Vic, the latest development, please.
Well, according to the Weather Bureau, that this typhoon is expected to make landfall early tomorrow morning. But already southern Taiwan is feeling its impact. Cities like Kaohsiung, Tainan, Pingtung, and Taidong, they are already experiencing heavy rains and strong winds. And so far, we have heard reports of flooding and landslides. But at this point, there has been no reports of serious damage. But authorities are not taking any chances because they say that what is dangerous about this typhoon is that it's moving at a very slow pace. It's currently traveling at about 8 kilometers per hour, so it's expected to linger longer. And the longer it lingers and hovers over Taiwan, the more damage it's likely to cause. Now, as it continues its course, it's expected to barrel the entire island for over the next 24 to even 48 hours. And in response, all domestic flights and ferry services have been canceled, and about 250 international flights have been suspended. Now, schools and offices in 22 counties and cities across the island have also been shut down. Even Taipei 101, Taiwan's tallest building, is closed today because of the storm. As of now, there have been at least 70 reported injuries related to the storm, and 2 are believed to be missing.
All right, Vic, you've mentioned that, no one is taking any chances. So what sort of precautionary measures are the government and residents, and including yourself, taking?
Well, President William Lai has warned that this typhoon could cause catastrophic damage to the island. So the government has already set up a central emergency operations center where he has instructed local governments to do their best to make sure that to minimize potential damage and casualties. At the same time, more than 40,000 troops are on standby for any relief and emergency efforts. At least 10,000 people from low-lying areas have been already evacuated to nearby shelters. Now, we're also seeing a lot of people queuing in grocery stores, trying to stock up on essential supplies such as food and water. And so basically before I came to work today, and that's what I was doing, and I could see that most of the shelves have been cleared out, but I managed to get some instant noodles and milk as well as eggs. At the same time, we're also seeing that many residents in low-lying areas, they're stacking up sandbags outside their homes to block floodwaters. Now, remember, this is one of the strongest typhoons to hit Taiwan this year. So authorities are urging the public to stay on high alert and also try to stay indoor for their own protection. Now, the Weather Bureau predicts that this typhoon is expected to hover over Taiwan over the next 2 days and is expected to leave Taiwan on Saturday.
Well, good to know you've got your instant noodles, milk and eggs all stocked up. Take good care in the meantime. Thanks so very much, CNA's Victoria Jen in Taipei. Escalating violence in the Middle East, raising the alarm in East Asia, with countries issuing fresh calls for citizens to leave the region. Chinese state media says that the government has evacuated more than 200 of its citizens from Lebanon. South Korea also following suit. President Suk-yeol has ordered an immediate dispatch of military transport aircraft to affected areas in the Middle East.
무엇보다 중요한 것은 우리 국민을 보호하는 것입니다. 현지에 계신 국민들의 안전을 위해 필요한 모든 조치를 취해 주기 바랍니다.
Mr. Yoon says the government has set up a 24-hour monitoring system to closely access related risks and take preemptive actions to protect South Korea's economy. He also called for a swift but measured response to any potential impact on the country's energy supply. South Korea is the fourth largest crude oil importer in the world, with most of its crude oil coming from the Middle East. Japan's Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, in the meantime, echoed urgent calls for calm, saying he is deeply concerned by Iran's latest overnight assault on Israel.
イランによる攻撃はこれはもう認められるものではございません。厳しくこれを非難したいと思っておりますが、これが全面戦争に拡大することがないようによく連携を取ってまいりたいし、事態の沈静化に共に努めてまいりたいと考えておるところでございます。
Concerns over the conflict spiraling further, intensifying. Iran has warned the U.S. not to get involved after U.S. President Joe Biden expressed full American support for Israel. Washington says it's discussing a joint response and will work with longtime ally Israel to ensure Iran faces severe consequences for its attack on Tuesday. Well, on the ground in Lebanon, Israel has issued a new warning for people in around 25 villages in the south. The alert comes as the IDF renews its bombardment of Lebanon's capital, Beirut, with at least a dozen airstrikes against what it said were targets belonging to Hezbollah. Meanwhile, Hezbollah says it has targeted Israeli military forces in northern Haifa city. The group earlier said it confronted Israeli forces infiltrating a town in the south and forced them to retreat. Lebanon's health ministry says about 1,900 people have been killed in almost a year of cross-border fighting. Well, earlier, CNA spoke to senior analyst Ryan Ball from Iran, from Gerald Fierstein from the Middle East Institute, and they weighed in on why Iran has chosen to strike back now and the likelihood of further escalation.
Iran certainly had a direct point here. It very clearly, through statements, said that this was a response for Ismail Hania's assassination in Tehran over the summer, the killing of Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut very recently, and the killing of its own general, IRGC general, alongside Nasrallah last month. So this is a retaliation that they were claiming was linked to those assassinations. But that being said, I don't think it's a coincidence that they decided to carry out this retaliation just as the Israelis announced ground operations in Lebanon. So in another sense, it was a warning to the Israelis that Iran is prepared to intervene in the course of its military campaign against Hezbollah in Lebanon.
This is the biggest question, and that is the unknown here, which is what does Benjamin Netanyahu actually want to do? What is his end game? Is he trying to create a rationale to attack Iran directly and perhaps even to drag the United States into a war with Iran? Or is he simply maneuvering to improve his domestic standing through these kinds of very aggressive moves that he's made in Lebanon and now with the Iranians? And this is the unknown. Unfortunately, up until now, despite U.S. efforts to mediate between Israel and Hamas and between Israel and Hezbollah, the Israelis so far have not been interested in finding diplomatic solutions. Their intention up until now has been to escalate. And whether that turns around now is a big question.
Israel has already warned that the attack will have consequences. Dr. Jessica Ganua from Flinders University tells us what these repercussions may be.
Israel is obviously trying to really severely decapitate and even dismantle the Hezbollah group. And one of the objectives here is to stop those rockets that have been shooting into Israel since about October 8th last year in an ongoing manner. That this is the most risky and volatile access point, we could say, of the current escalating conflict. Because what we're starting to see now with Israel's actions against Hezbollah in Lebanon, who were obviously a proxy force for Iran in the region, we're now starting to see a response from Iran itself directly towards Israel. This is a very dangerous situation because now we're starting to get much closer towards what could be direct military exchange between Iran and Israel. And whilst that's not a situation that I think Iran wants or Israel wants or could honestly absorb, and it's certainly not a situation that the United States or other international actors want to see, it's very hard to see how either Iran or Israel will manage to de-escalate from this point.
Over in South Korea, President Yoon Suk-yeol has vetoed 3 opposition-led bills, including one that calls for a special probe into allegations of corruption against First Lady Kim Kyung-hee, which was seen as the most contentious. The First Lady has been accused of being involved with manipulating the stock prices of a car dealer in South Korea, as well as receiving a luxury handbag that's worth about $2,200 in exchange for favors. The opposition party has been heavily pushing for a similar bill before, but that was vetoed by President Yoon in January. Well, the scrapping of that bill appears to coincide with a decision by prosecutors not to charge the First Lady. Ms. Kim was cleared of charges that she had violated the anti-graft law, with the prosecution saying that the gift she received had no bearing on the president's official duties, nor did she give out any favors in return. The second vetoed bill included a demand for a probe into allegations that officials had meddled with a military investigation into the death of a Marine while on duty last year. And a third bill proposed the distribution of more vouchers to help boost the economy. Well, since taking office in May 2022, Mr. Yoon has exercised his veto power a total of 11 times, while setting a record of scrapping 24 bills. Well, tensions have been running high between him and the opposition-controlled National Assembly. The ruling People Power Party holds a little more than a third of Assembly seats, while more than 2/3 of votes are needed to pass a bill. President Yoon's approval ratings have also dropped to the lowest this week since he took office. Time now for a break, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, the yen weakening a touch against the greenback after Japan's central bank chief highlights the need for caution in raising interest rates. BMW, the latest German car maker to urge Berlin to vote against the EU's tariffs on Chinese-made EVs. Hello Hello there. Good to have your company on East Asia tonight. It is now time for your business news with Roland Lim. And Roland, we're hearing about Hong Kong stocks returning from a one-day break with a big bang. What's that all about?
That's right, Oteli. The bulls are definitely in charge in Hong Kong, sending even the shares of defaulted Chinese developers to their highest in more than a year. Hong Kong stocks up for the sixth session in a row, riding on that buying frenzy sparked by China's stimulus blitz. Remember, Beijing last week unveiled a raft of measures to help lift the struggling economy with an emphasis on the real estate sector. And that's helping property stocks stage a comeback. The Hang Seng Mainland Properties Index skyrocketing along with individual stocks such as Long4 Group. Investors even venturing into shares of some defaulted Chinese developers such as Shimao Group and Sunac. Shimao more than doubling today, while Sunac is up an eye-watering 75%. It's a completely different picture for the rest of East Asia, which closed in the red. In Tokyo, the Nikkei 225, the big underdog, losing 2.18% today. Tech shares were sold down following their U.S. counterparts overnight. Kospi in Seoul also shedding 1.2%. And Taiwan's stock markets closed today because of Super Typhoon Krathon. The Bank of Japan must stay vigilant to fallout from unstable markets and global uncertainties. That's the message from the central bank chief, underscoring the need to bolster economic recovery and to be cautious in raising rates. Now, it comes after Japan's newly appointed economy minister, Ryosei Akazawa, said that the prime minister wants the central bank to be cautious when hiking rates further. In his first news conference, Mr. Akazawa stressed the government wants the BOJ to share its view that a complete exit from deflation is the country's top priority, and to make careful decisions on whether to raise interest rates again. The minister also emphasized that the administration would closely communicate and coordinate with the BOJ to decisively beat deflation. The Bank of Japan raised rates in July but kept policy steady at the September meeting, saying that it could afford to spend time eyeing the fallout from global economic uncertainties. The dovish stance of both the central bank and the new government, leading the yen to weaken by about 0.5%, currently trading at 144.19 to the dollar, from about 143.50 at the start of Asian trade today. As Japan continues on a policy tightening path, its investors are redirecting their capital back home. Now, years of negative interest rates have led Japanese investors to head overseas in search of higher yields. With $4.4 trillion invested abroad, that's an amount larger than India's economy. The speed and size of any pullback could disrupt global markets. In the first 8 months of the year, Japanese investors snapped up a net $192 billion of the nation's government bonds, the largest amount for the period in at least 14 years. They also cut purchases of foreign bonds almost half to $53 billion, and their buying of overseas equities was less than $7 billion. Now, the stakes are massive. Japan's investors are the largest foreign holders of U.S. government bonds and own almost 10% of Australia's debt. They also control hundreds of billions of dollars worth of stocks from Singapore to the Netherlands and the U.S., owning anywhere between 1% and 2% of these markets. Even as analysts predict a gradual flow of capital back into Japan, they see this as the start of a super cycle for the next decade. The overseas investments of the Japanese have been compared to a giant carry trade, where investors benefited from ultra-low interest rates available at home to fund purchases abroad. But the tide is starting to turn as the central bank hiked rates in late July. Now, yields for the benchmark 30-year Japanese government bonds have risen about 40 basis points to above 2%. BMW is urging the German government to vote against the EU's imposition of sharply higher tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles. Now, it joins its peers in pressuring Berlin as German carmakers want to avoid risking a spat in their most important market. BMW's CEO warned that extra taxes would harm German firms with global presence and could provoke a trade dispute. Now, on Friday, EU member states will vote on slapping definitive tariffs as high as 45% on imported EVs made in China. It would take a qualified majority, that's 5 member states representing 65% of the bloc's population, to block the taxes. German officials signaled the government plans to abstain instead of voting no. It also said it expects a significant number of EU members to abstain, and this could make it harder for the bloc's implementation of the tariffs. At the same time, China's Commerce Ministry has asked the World Trade Organization to rule on Canada's imposition of tariffs on Chinese EVs, as well as steel and aluminium products. The ministry warned it will start an anti-discriminatory probe into Canada's measures. More labor troubles on American shores, this time threatening global supply chains. Nearly 50,000 dock workers in the U.S. are on strike for the first time in decades. The strike is expected to choke off deliveries of everything from produce to auto parts at cargo ports from Maine to Texas. Analysts say it could become the country's most disruptive work stoppage in decades, and the ripple effects could be felt throughout the globe, including here in Asia and across Europe. Now, a prolonged walkout could boost global shipping rates, which in turn could eventually raise retail prices. Kate Fisher reports.
After failing to agree a new contract, 45,000 port workers with the International Longshoremen's Association Union walked off the job early on Tuesday morning. It's their first large-scale industrial action in nearly 50 years. Negotiations over a new 6-year contract with the group representing their employers, the United States Maritime Alliance, broke down in a dispute over wages. The union's demanding a $5 an hour increase in pay each year. It also wants a guarantee that the ports will not introduce any form of automation. The International Longshoremen's Association Union said it will stay on the picket lines until its demands are met.
The ILA is fighting for respect, appreciation, and fairness in a world in which corporations are dead set on replacing hardworking people with automation.
36 ports along the U.S. East Coast, stretching from Maine down to Texas, are affected, resulting in delays on shipments of everything from food to clothes to cars. Retailers account for about half of all container shipping volume, and with the winter holidays approaching, their most lucrative time of the year, some have been implementing backup plans like shipping to ports on the West Coast instead. Many of the big players rushed in Halloween and Christmas merchandise early to avoid any strike-related disruptions. They incurred extra costs to ship and store those goods, though. Automakers Hyundai and GM say they're monitoring the strike and they do have contingency plans in place. Well, the White House is scrambling to contain the economic and political fallout, with the Labour-friendly President Biden urging the group representing the port employers to present a fair offer to the striking workers. He said that he will not use a federal labour law to break the strike and force workers back on the job, despite pressure from Republicans. The White House says it's monitoring the effects on the supply chain and, quote, assessing ways to address potential impacts, while noting that the initial effect on consumers is expected to be limited. The US Department of Agriculture has said that it doesn't expect significant changes to food prices or availability in the near term. But a stoppage lasting weeks could cost the economy $4.5 billion to $7.5 billion every week, as workers dependent on the ports are furloughed and manufacturers experience delivery delays. That's according to Oxford economics analysts. With just under 5 weeks to go until the presidential election, that could have an impact not just on workers, but on voters. Kate Fisher, CNA, Washington.
And that'll do it for the business news. Otelli.
Thanks so very much for the business update, Roland. Well, we're going to go for a short break now, but coming up on East Asia tonight, Chinese Coast Guard vessels enter the Arctic for the first time, joining Russian counterparts to patrol the region in a bid to explore alternative trade routes. Typhoon Krathon's landfall in Taiwan is now expected on Thursday, with shops closed and markets halted today. 40,000 troops are in standby for the emergency response. Escalating Middle East violence has East Asia on alert. Japan's prime minister calls Iran's missile attacks on Israel unacceptable, while South Korea and China evacuate some of their citizens from Lebanon. And South Korea's President Suk-yeol vetoes 3 bills, including one calling for a probe into First Lady Kim Kyung-hee's alleged corruption. The opposition plans to push for a revote. A Chinese Coast Guard fleet has reportedly entered the Arctic Ocean for the first time for a joint patrol with its Russian counterparts. Chinese state media says that the arrival of the fleet coincides with the anniversaries of China's founding and the establishment of diplomatic ties with Russia. The latest joint patrol follows similar ones that the two nations have been conducting in the northern Pacific Ocean since September. China and Russia have been working together to develop Arctic shipping routes, with Moscow seeking to deliver more oil and gas to Beijing amid Western sanctions. China, meanwhile, is looking for an alternative shipping route to reduce its dependence on the Strait of Malacca in Southeast Asia. Although significantly shorter, Arctic shipping routes are challenging and often require the assistance of icebreakers to help vessels pass along the northern coast of Russia. Leading experts from around the world are gathering in Riyadh for a 2-day cybersecurity forum. Earlier, my colleague Yasmin Yonkers spoke with Chris Inglis, a former U.S. National Cyber Director who's at the summit, and she asked him about the security threats posed by malicious actors as well as by social media.
How are you advising on state-sponsored financial attacks? We know North Korea and their alleged cryptocurrency targets are known to be very sophisticated. Do we understand how detrimental their reach could be?
Well, we do understand what the consequences of their bad behaviors can be, and we need to bring some measures to bear to hold them accountable. But at the end of the day, I think they'll still do what they can to try to continue to acquire resources using cyber methods. So we need to focus on the other end of the problem as well, is how do we make ourselves more resilient, more robust, to increase the cost to them of actually succeeding in their bad behaviors, to make ourselves sufficiently resilient and robust that it's simply a much harder, if not impossible, problem for them to succeed. So I think there are 3 parts to this. 1, increase the inherent resilience, robustness of the infrastructure upon which we rely. 2, be vigilant in the defense of that and do so through collective action. And then finally, impose consequences on the North Koreans or others who would act badly in this space. If we do all 3 of those things, then I think that we have a fair chance of not simply defending that space, but of having confidence that those resources, those processes that we execute through cyber will in fact work for us.
And looking out for the bad hats was what you did as National Cyber Director. And at the time, when you were in that position, American security concerns about TikTok came up. And now the company's fighting the case in the U.S. Now that you've had over a year away from your government role, how has your view shifted on threats posed by social media companies like TikTok?
Well, it hasn't shifted very much. I still believe what I believed then, which is the legal frameworks within which these companies operate. That's the most important issue. We need to make sure that whatever rights, privileges we owe to our citizens are in fact delivered, not simply by governments, but by the private sector that is on the front lines of delivering those services. That's the issue with TikTok. It's not that we believe that there's a malicious effort underway at TikTok by its employees, but the legal framework that would guard the information that users provide into TikTok, we need to make sure that that has the same legal protections it would in a country like the United States or like-minded nations.
Well, the escalating crisis in the Middle East also looming over the U.S. vice presidential debate that took place earlier. Democratic Governor Tim Walz and Republican Senator J.D. Vance squared off on the debate floor with just 5 weeks to go until the November elections. Well, the 90-minute televised match hosted by CBS is the only scheduled showdown between the two candidates. In the mostly cordial exchange, Walz and Vance fact-checked each other's claims, sometimes traded barbs on the policies of their rival party, and spoke extensively on the issues of immigration, abortion, gun violence, the U.S. economy, and the Mideast.
So Iran is closer to a nuclear weapon than they were before because of Donald Trump's fickle leadership.
Who has been the vice president for the last 3.5 years? And the answer is your running mate, not mine.
Well, Nick Harper tells us more about the policy-heavy debate and the standout moments.
This was a much more civilized debate tone than we would normally see on the debate stage. It was largely cordial. At the very end of the debate, the Democrat Tim Walz said that he had enjoyed tonight's debate. He said there was a lot of commonality. In many ways, this was focused much more on policy and far less on personal attacks, something we've certainly seen on the debate stage in the past. But there were some major points of contention, one of them coming in the last 10 or 15 minutes or so of the debate, and that revolved around the 2020 election result and the ensuing chaos on January the 6th when Donald Trump's supporters invaded the US Capitol building. During that exchange, J.D. Vance refused to say whether or not Donald Trump had lost the 2020 election, and he refused to say whether he would accept this upcoming election result if the Trump-Vance ticket were to lose. And to all of that, Tim Walz said it was a damning non-answer, and he accused Vance of revisionist history after Vance had claimed that Donald Trump had peacefully handed over power. Of course, the scenes on January the 6th suggested that was very much not the case. They also clashed over the issues of abortion, the economy and immigration. One moment when they were talking about immigration, and they returned to it on several occasions, resulted in the moderators having to cut their mics to silence them to be able to move on the debate. The first question to them, they were asked whether they would carry out a preemptive strike on Iran to try and help defend Israel if they were to be in the White House. Neither of them directly addressed that, J.D. Vance instead saying it was up to Israel.
Time now for another break, but hang in there because coming up in East Asia tonight, extreme fan culture in China leaves athletes vexed as its effects stretch beyond matches and into their well-being. The world's top swimmers will be in Shanghai this month for the World Aquatic Swimming World Cup. Among them, China's very own Olympic stars. Some have been on the receiving end of extreme attention from fans since their return from Paris. And CNA's Tanya Guan finds out what's behind China's so-called toxic fans.
When top Chinese gymnast Zhang Bohen landed at Beijing airport, he had to be escorted out by security after being forced to hide in the toilet from hordes of fans. He's not alone. When double gold medalist diver Chen Hongchan was in Macau on her post-Olympic victory tour, she was also mobbed at her hotel and forced to take refuge at the toilet too. These scenes remind Xiao of her days as an ardent fan of a particular singer-songwriter. She knows how crazy fans can get, and for that reason, she's asked to mask her real identity for this interview.
我也是做过粉丝的，所以我知道，粉丝可能对于他 idol 的一些评论都比较敏感的，所以我比较害怕。
In her days as a fan, Xiao has done her fair share of going head over heels over her idol.
我那个时候一个月工资可能6、7千吧，然后我可能看一场演唱会的花费，一张票可能就是5000多，然后可能它不一定在上海开，我还要在往返在那个城市的这个机票的钱，然后还有酒店的钱，然后还有吃饭的钱，可能看一场演唱会总共的花费就能够超过我一个月的工资了。
As a counselor, Dr. Hu has encountered far worse. He once counseled a nurse who chalked up 500,000 yuan or $70,000 in debt just chasing after her idol. Dr. Hu was called in after debtors started showing up at the hospital.
粉丝他其实是在寻求归属感，那么组织的粉丝他其实是有资本推动，那么跟粉丝本身的情感推动。一旦发生了叠加，或者说发生了重合，那这个时候它爆发出的这种情感， 的力量很大。
Fans screaming over their idols, coughing up good money, egged on by entertainment companies. All that's nothing new. But there's something different about the adoring fans that are descending on China's sporting stars. For one, there are no entertainment companies involved. For another, there are no official fan clubs. So who or what is driving the chaos? And it's chaos indeed. Remember Quan Hongchan, who's mobbed in Macau? This was the scene outside her home in rural Guangzhou. According to social media reports, the adoring mobs were so bad, the family couldn't even sleep at night. As a psychology professor at a sports university, Dr. He Lingfeng has counseled sporting stars in his office. He thinks the athletes themselves, though through no fault of theirs, may have unknowingly pushed some fans into extreme behaviors. And there are things that can be done to curb the overflow of passion and adoration.
运动员，因为他们每天的生活方式其实就是训练，在这种与人交往、社会表现，或者是能够去迎合粉丝的那个需求去做出表达的时候，他是远远不如电影明星的。我建议体育队啊，其实是应该给他们提供一些基本的这种训练的。如果体育明星呢，其实在公众面前出现的时候，如果能够回馈给粉丝他们需要的一些东西，然后再告诉他们接下来应该怎么做，其实就不会出现特别极端的事儿。其实你要知道，就是这些粉丝过来，他们是有要求的，就是你摆几个 pose 嘛，对吧？你说几句话嘛，然后你安抚一下粉丝嘛，对吧？
Those will be useful tips for authorities here in Shanghai. From October 18 for 3 days, the first leg of the World Aquatic Swimming World Cup will be held here at the Oriental Swimming Complex behind me. All of China's Olympic swimming stars are expected to compete here. Given their newfound celebrity status, authorities would have their hands full keeping the mobs in check without a trick or two. Tai Guan, CNA, Shanghai.
Of course, toxic fandom works both ways. When athletes win, they're worshipped, but lose and they are mercilessly trolled. Well, here to tell us more, we have Mark Dreyer, author of Sporting Superpower, and he is joining us from London. Hi, Mark. Well, thanks for being on East Asia tonight. Well, we heard there, Yuguan's story was pretty eye-opening. You know, seeing the athletes cowering and hiding in toilets, that's pretty extreme. But from what you have heard, from what you have seen, what are some of the other more jaw-dropping cases of toxic fandom in Chinese sports?
Well, I think as mentioned in the piece, this is not a new thing, particularly. I remember when David Beckham came to China just about 10 years ago, there was a stampede, and I believe 7 or 8 people were actually injured and had to be treated in hospital. More recently, when Lionel Messi was playing in a friendly match in Beijing, I was at the hotel where fans were awaiting his arrival. This was about 18 months or so ago in Beijing. And it was legitimately scary. It was out of control. There weren't nearly enough security guards. The crowds were surging forward every time they thought the bus that may have or may not have been carrying Messi was arriving at the hotel. And I saw some youngish children, not seriously injured, but sort of falling over and trampled to some extent. And it definitely could have got out of control. Authorities realized that there was a problem, and many of Messi's public appearances were then cancelled, and he had to do a lot of online appearances instead. But it's just this extreme, intersection between the sports and the celebrity, whether it's music and entertainment stars, whether it's sports. It's this passion from the fans that kind of spills out of control. And then added to that, you just have the numbers in China where you get the crowd sizes larger than you would in other parts of the world, and it can turn into fairly scary situations, as I said, with potential stampedes or people cowering in toilets, as we heard earlier.
And Mark, I mean, social media, a breeding ground for toxic fans. And I'm wondering, how much responsibility do you think platforms like Weibo or Douyin bear in terms of, enabling abusive behavior? And I believe in China, the government recently, there was this crackdown. There was this Beijing's Public Security Bureau's recent actions where they arrested, certain suspects. Do you think all those measures are enough?
Well, there's been official messaging to basically tone it down. That's the message to the fans. I think there's a couple of differences with Chinese social media and their sports stars in the West, for example, in other countries and China. Number one, the platforms are very heavily censored. So you're not going to get the level of abuse that many sports stars in the West face. Some of the female tennis players, and they've been in China this week for the China Open in Beijing, they've spoken in the past few weeks about the abuse when they lose a match that they've been facing, and they're sort of speaking out saying it's too much. So you're not going to quite get that level of offensiveness, but you do have people that are out of control in terms of their excitement. Pan Jianle, who's China's probably top swimming star, he won 2 gold medals at the Paris Olympics. He spoke about the fact that it was just too much for him, and he actually was contemplating, would it have been better to have actually performed worse and not receive the attention that he's getting. And the final thing I'll say in this is China's sports stars aren't as media trained as perhaps their counterparts in the West. So they're not used to these interactions. They're not used to the press conferences and facing some more pointed questions. It's a little bit more delicate. Chan Huangchen, the diver who we saw, her hometown was overrun. She was a very lively character and welcomed, I think, a lot of that attention, was quite comfortable with it. But it was her family members that sort of found it a bit too much when people were camping outside her home and saying, look, we can't sleep, leave us alone. So, you've got the individual personalities, and then you've got the related entourages and the families feeling the hassle there as well. And then you've got the dynamic of China's online platforms too.
And it's not great. I mean, if the athlete is saying that perhaps I should lose, just so that they can avoid getting such attention. But do you think, Mark, you can actually be a champion and stay under the radar these days? Or is it just a pipe dream in the age of social media?
Well, it very much depends on the sports. China won 40 gold medals at the Paris Olympics. So if you pick, 5 or 6 of them who are weightlifters, they're obviously named, they're Olympic champions, no disrespect whatsoever, but they're unlikely to be mobbed in the streets outside of their sort of smaller hometown. So it's the top stars in the top sports. So historically, you've got badminton, table tennis. We have now Zheng Qinwen, a tennis player who's playing in Beijing and getting packed out crowds there. So she is probably just beginning to feel the impacts of the fame. The swimmers, as we've heard, have felt the impact of this as well. So it does very much make a difference as to what sport and how long you've been at the top of the level. But yes, there's a full range of situations, I would say, here.
And national pride, obviously a powerful force when it comes to Chinese sports. How do you think the intense patriotism, for instance, actually sort of perhaps contribute to toxic fandom when things don't go China's way?
Well, the most obvious example is football, soccer. The Chinese football team have been, there's no really nice way to put this, but they've been atrocious for as long as I can remember. And it seems to be, they seem to be still hitting new lows, if that can be believed. A recent game they lost in a World Cup qualifier, so a match of some importance, 7-0 to Japan. And, obviously fans taking out their anger online and the few who are at the stadium as well. So it's been difficult to be a Chinese football player. You've got the whole match fixing elements and other things in there as well. But yes, I can't imagine too many parents are pushing their budding young sporting stars into becoming football players today in China because, even at the top level, there's not a whole lot of adulation. And, as we've heard, the adulation sometimes can be too much. But really in football, it's mostly just abuse.
Right. And seeing the extreme lengths that, these fans go to, I'm wondering, do you think sports stars, especially in China and the region, they've reached the same stratosphere as these A-listers, like the actors and actresses?
I think they have, yes, at the top level. So those, the big names in table tennis, Jiang Qinwen is an interesting one because she is the tennis player. She won Olympic gold in the singles competition in Paris, but she's also pretty global and she speaks good English. And that I mentioned that because it means that she can legitimately become a global star. Then you have, Eileen Gu is another one from the winter sports circle that has that kind of global connection. Then you are sort of faced with this slightly delicate situation where you want the fame, you want the adulation because you have a huge amount of sponsorship and revenue and fans and people who are pushing you to be bigger and be that ambassador at a higher level as possible. Whereas some of these other stars who just want to focus on their sports, they don't want the attention. They don't necessarily need or get the sponsorships in the same way. So it's a little bit of a balance. So you've got different situations. Some are much more like the pop stars. Others are kind of more in the sporting realm. And then you have sort of the lower profile stars who, depending on the sport, can still keep somewhat of a lower profile in China.
Well, it's been great speaking with you. Thanks so much for your insights. Mark Dreyer, author of Sporting Superpower. And just before we go, we turn to Japan, where its very first bullet train service, the Tokaido Shinkansen, just marked its 60th anniversary.
60年間で約70億人のお客様にご利用いただきました。改めて深く感謝を申し上げたいと思います。
Staff of the Central Japan Railway, along with train enthusiasts, gathered for a celebratory send-off for the first train of the day at the Tokyo station.
こうして60年を迎えたっていうことですので、やはりその長い間ずっと安心安全に走ってきたっていうその感慨深さというのをやはり鉄道ファンの一人としてはやはりより一層感じた日になりましたね。
やはり日本の新幹線は車内が非常に綺麗で、しかも乗り心地も非常に素晴らしいですし、あと時間も短いので、観光などするときには非常に便利です。
Japan's Shinkansen, which only ran between Tokyo and Osaka at first, became the envy of the world when it began its operations just ahead of the opening of the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. Then it went at an unprecedented top speed of 210 kilometers per hour, a design achieved by experts in aerodynamics.
車両を設計する部門の多く、方々の中に、その旧陸軍、戦闘機とか設計されて、戦闘機とか爆撃機とかを設計されておられた方がいらして、その経験が例えば新幹線の車両のその流線形の部分であるとか、要するに空気抵抗とかそういったものに少ない車体を設計するとか、そういったものに生かされていますね。
Yet faster designs are on the way. Central Japan Railway is building the next generation Shinkansen using magnetic levitation. Well, that's using only magnetic fields and nothing else to lift the train off the tracks. And this could see the train go up to 500 kilometers an hour, connecting Tokyo and Osaka in just 1 hour, more than half the existing travel time. And that's East Asia tonight. Thanks for watching.